typically with a tax, the tax is either, by law levied on the buyer or the seller, right? So when you go to the store and you pay a sales tax, that tax legally must be paid by the buyer, okay? And so the previous example we did, the tax was on the seller, right? So legally the seller was responsible for paying that money to the government, okay? So now it turns out no matter who is taxed, both buyer and seller end up sharing the burden of the tax, okay? So that's why I have this kind of note written here. In reality, both buyer and seller share the burden of the tax, regardless of who actually is taxed, whether it's the buyer or the seller, right? Because what happens is the price adjusts in the market so that buyer and seller actually share this tax. So what do I mean? Well, let's go back to the example we just did, and I've got kind of a nice clean version I'll put together here, okay? So the example we had previously done was that there was a tax on sellers, and we implemented it, we shifted the supply curve over, right? And we had labeled all our areas. This triangle up here is consumer surplus, this is producer surplus down here. This large rectangle here, this is tax, revenue, okay? And this last little triangle here is our dead weight loss triangle, okay? Now, notice what happens when the tax is implemented, right? The tax is legally charged to the seller. The buyer doesn't have to pay anything to the government. But what does the seller do? The seller responds by reducing their supply and therefore pushing that price up, right? So the burden of the tax that the buyer pays is really the increase in the price above that equilibrium price, right? The buyer has to pay a higher price, so therefore the buyer's actually paying some of that tax, okay? Now, the seller obviously doesn't make as much money as before, and so this part down here is the share that the seller bears, right? So this is the buyer's share of the burden of tax burden. And down here, this is the seller's share of tax burden. Okay? And so that's what we mean by they both share the burden of the tax, right? The price goes up for the buyer. The seller doesn't get as much as they would have received before, which would have been the equilibrium price. Okay, so buyer and seller always share in this tax burden. Okay. Okay, well now let's throw in another wrinkle here, right? The way we had done that diagram is the supply and demand curves were kind of similar elasticities. Okay. So let's do the example again, same example, but let's assume demand for coffee is very inelastic, right? And if we've done this before, this means our demand curve is steeper, okay? So when the demand's more inelastic, it usually means a kind of steeper demand curve, okay? So let's see how elasticity plays into this question of who actually bears the tax burden. Who ends up paying more of this tax between the buyer and the seller. Okay. All right. So let's do our example again. Same graph. And again, I've drawn the supply curve, so it's exactly the same. But what I've done is I've made my demand curve really steep. Okay. So this is when the demand curve is much more inelastic than the supply curve. Okay. So let's go ahead and just kind of walk through the same steps of our problem, right? The tax is still, whoa, lost my Apple Pencil. The tax is still the same 70-cent tax, and it's levied on the sellers, okay? So that's why I've got the two dots there. I'm just speeding up this process, okay? I'm going to show the implementation of the tax. Therefore, I'm going to shift the supply curve to the left. ST, this is my new supply curve, okay? New supply, new demand curve. Sorry, new supply curve, same old demand curve. So here is our new equilibrium point. I'm labeling there. So just like before, let's go ahead and label that price and quantity. Okay, well, that's actually not very good. Not very precise. Let's redo that. There we go. Let's do right into here. Okay. Yeah, that's better. Okay. And let's go ahead and put this down here. Okay. This is quantity after the tax. Okay. All right. So this price up here is the price the buyer now pays, right? That tax causes that supply curve to shift to the left, and so the price the buyer pays goes up there, okay? Now remember, the seller doesn't get to keep all of that. You have to subtract off, right? So go up here to our equilibrium point and subtract off vertically, go all the way down here to the old supply curve right here. That's the size of the tax. So we subtract this amount, that is, we go down. And this down here is the money the seller now keeps after the tax. I'm going to label that with a P and an S, okay? So the upper price, this is what the buyer pays. Buyer pays, okay? And this lower price here is what seller keeps after the tax, after tax. Okay, so we've done this part before, and we can label in all the different areas, okay? So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go nice orange. This area up here is, of course, consumer surplus, okay? Let's go here, CS. Okay. And let's do the area down below. And this time let's use, I don't know, let's use a light green for producer surplus. Okay, let's go ahead and fill this in. Okay. Okay. So now let me label that. That is producer surplus. Okay. And again, tax revenue is that middle rectangle, and the little triangle here on the end is deadweight loss that I haven't really filled in. But at this point, we're talking more about tax burden and less about deadweight loss. Okay, so now I'm going to get rid of this so it makes it a little easier to see my diagram. Okay, so now let's think about who bears this tax burden, right? Same supply curve as before. Same 70-cent tax. The only thing I changed is the demand curve. I just made the demand curve more inelastic, that is steeper, okay? And when we do that, what do we see? We see that the buyer now pays more of that tax burden, right? So buyer's price increases a lot, okay? The seller, sure, the seller loses a little bit of money because of the tax, but seller loses a little, right? This tax revenue rectangle is mostly made up of what used to be consumer surplus, right? This whole area up here all used to be consumer surplus above this equilibrium line, right? And the consumer loses a lot. Like the price goes up for the buyer, price falls a little bit for the seller, but the buyer's clearly more affected, okay? And so this allows us to kind of summarize this. Okay, we're going to do this example again, but we'll get to that in a second, right? the key idea here is that the burden of the tax, right? No matter if the tax is put on the buyer or the seller, the actual tax burden, who is affected in the market after it's all said and done, the burden of the tax falls more upon the group with the more inelastic curve. Okay? And that's what we see in the example we just did, right? The group that has the more inelastic curve is the buyers in this case. And if we go back to our drawing, we can see that that tax mostly comes out of the increased price that the buyer pays. Seller loses a little bit of money, but not as much as the buyer loses, okay? And so we come back to this, the burden of the tax always falls more upon the group with the more inelastic curve, okay? All right, so now let's come back up here and let's do this again. Now I'm not going to draw it all out. We've already gone through this at least twice now. I'm just going to show you what this diagram looks like after it's drawn. But let's flip it around. What if the supply curve is now more inelastic than the demand curve? Okay. Well, and that's the nicely drawn diagram I have here, rather than going through it step by step. We've already gone through it twice. So if I take the demand curve and make it just like my demand curves before, it's no longer more inelastic, and instead I make the supply curve more inelastic. That is, the supply curve is going to be steeper than it was before, okay? And then if I do the same thing, I shift this supply curve by the same distance. Notice this distance in between my supply curves right here is the same vertical distance on all those other diagrams, okay? And when I do this, notice that after I finish my drawing, the increase in the price for the buyer is fairly small, but the seller now has a big decrease in price, right? Notice how the drop in money for the seller compared to the old equilibrium price is large. The increase in price for the buyer is now small, okay? And notice the sellers are now the one with a very much more inelastic curve, okay? So this goes back to what I'd said on the previous slide, which is that the burden of the tax always falls more upon the group that has a more inelastic curve.